Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G. Welcome back to Star-Spangled Studies. In our last episode, we navigated through the contradictory but also interesting period of the Progressive Era. Today, we stand at the precipice of a new century and a new era, and a conflict that would irrevocably reshape America and its place in the world. World War One, or as it was known at the time, the Great War. So let's go. The United States stumbled into the inferno of World War I in 1917 and emerged irrevocably altered. As our textbook notes, quote, the war heralded to the world the United States' potential as a global military power, and domestically it advanced, but then beat back American progressivism by unleashing vicious waves of repression. This cataclysmic war didn't just reshape European borders and topple enemies. It seared itself into the American psyche, testing its ideals and exposing its deepest contradictions. To understand the impact, we first must listen to the voices of those who faced its brutal reality. The poet Alan Seeger, an American who joined the French Foreign Legion before the U.S. entered the war, captured the grim anticipation of many young men with his haunting words, quote, I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade, and I to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous. Seeger would not fail that rendezvous. He was killed in 1916. His words serve as a somber prelude to a conflict that would claim millions worldwide, including 115,000 American soldiers in little more than 1 year of fighting. But the road to war and why America entered such a war was paved by the legacies of the recent past that we've taken a look at in our previous episodes. The path to war was neither straight nor universally desired. It began in a nation deeply engrossed in its own progressive era debates, a period of intense social and political reform. The America of the early 20th century was a nation in profound transition, and nowhere was this more evident than the election of 1912, which we talked about last episode. The four-way contest that was a testament, of course, to the fractured political landscape and the diverse, often competing visions for how to address the challenges wrought by industrialization and urbanization to really direct how progressivism would flow. The incumbent, William Howard Taft, represented the more conservative republicanism. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, feeling Taft had swayed from progressive principles, thundered back with his bull moose progressive party and the platform that he called New Nationalism. Roosevelt argued for a powerful federal government to act as the steward of public welfare, regulating big businesses, and ensuring social justice. As he declared in 1910, quote, the new nationalism puts the national need before sectional or personal advantage, end quote. Challenging both Republicans was a Democratic governor of New Jersey, a man named Woodrow Wilson, with his new freedom agenda. Wilson was also a progressive, initially differed from Roosevelt, emphasizing the need to break up monopolies to restore competition rather than merely regulating them. He argued that, quote, life has become complex. It is harder to keep everything adjusted, and that the government intervention in business and in other places was necessary. Freedom today, Wilson proclaimed, is something more than being let alone. The program of a government of freedom must in these days be positive, not merely a negative, end quote. Representing the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs garnered nearly 1 million votes in this election, underscoring the growing appeal of more radical solutions to the economic inequality found in progressive America. Wilson ultimately triumphed due to the deep split in the Republican vote. His early administration was largely consumed by domestic reforms. We talked about this last time. The Underwood Tariff, the Federal Reserve Act, restructuring the nation's banking system, the Clayton-Yancey Trust Act to strengthen measures against monopolies, and this domestic focus reflected America's primary concerns with its own internal challenges, a direction of which where we should put progressive ideas. Yet even in these early days, the contradictions inherent in the progressive era and in Wilson himself were apparent. His eloquent calls for democracy and justice, which would later define his wartime rhetoric, coexisted uneasily with his administration's decision to segregate federal government departments in Washington, D.C., which was a significant setback for Black civil rights and a stark reminder of Reconstruction's unfinished business. Furthermore, Wilson's assertive and at times imperialistic interventions in Latin America, such as the occupation of Veracruz in Mexico in 1914 and the purchase of the Virgin Islands, demonstrated a willingness to once again project American power abroad. This foreshadowed his later global leadership, but it also reflected the existing imperialist tendencies seen under presidents that were deemed progressive, like McKinley at the start of the century, but also Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. The ideals of the progressive era were thus a complex mix of domestic reform, moral idealism, and an emerging, often contradictory vision of America's role in the world. When war erupted in Europe in August of 1914, triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, President Wilson swiftly declared American neutrality. He urged the nation to be, quote, neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought as well as in action, end quote. This stance resonated deeply with an American public historically wary of entangling themselves in European wars, a sentiment tracing back to George Washington's farewell address, which cautioned against, quote, foreign alliances, attachments, and intrigues, end quote. However, maintaining true neutrality in an increasingly interconnected world, especially one where American economic interests were now so deeply intertwined with the belligerent countries, proved an immense challenge. As our textbook notes, quote, it was unclear what neutrality meant in a world of close economic connections. The United States by 1914 was the world's leading industrial economy, producing roughly 1/3 of global manufactured goods. Ties to Great Britain and France were particularly strong, and these nations quickly became the primary recipients of American loans and supplies. In October of 1914, Wilson approved commercial credit loans to the combatants, a decision that, as our textbook states, quote, made it increasingly difficult for the nation to claim impartiality as war swept through Europe, end quote. The economic data is stark. U.S. exports to Europe skyrocketed from $1.479 billion in 1913 to $4.06 billion in 1917. Munition shipments to the Allies surged from approximately $6 million in 1914 to nearly $500 million in 1917. And American bankers extended over $2 billion in loans to the Allied powers before the U.S. even entered the war. This wartime trade pulled the American economy out of a recession that had begun in 1914, creating powerful economic incentives that leaned heavily towards an Allied victory and subtly eroded the foundations of strict neutrality. I didn't mention it yet, but the Allied powers were France and Great Britain. The first major shock to public opinion about the war came a few years before we entered, on May 7, 1915, with the sinking of the British passenger liner, the RMS Lusitania, by a German U-boat. Over 1,100 lives were lost, including 128 Americans. As the American yacht notes about this attack, quote, coupled with other German attacks on American and British shipping, It raised the ire of the public and stoked the desire for war, end quote. While initial reactions were varied, with some newspapers like the New York Times headlining, quote, divergent views on the sinking of the Lusitania, the event undeniably hardened anti-German sentiment. Former President Theodore Roosevelt called for swift retaliation, though President Wilson urged caution, still hoping to keep America out of this global conflict. Germany defended its actions, claiming that the Lusitania carried munitions, but the sinking became a potent symbol of German brutality in Allied propaganda. Spoiler, the Lusitania was carrying munitions. The final straw came in early 1917. Germany, frustrated by the effective British naval blockade and gambling on a quick victory, announced the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st, 1917, targeting all ships, neutral or otherwise, in the war zone. This was a direct challenge to American maritime rights and safety. Then, in February, the British government presented President Wilson with an intercepted German communication, what would be known as the Zimmermann telegram. This astonishing message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico proposed a military alliance against the United States should America enter the war. Germany promised Mexico, quote, generous financial support and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the territory lost in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, end quote. Our textbook states that the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram to the public, quote, helped usher the United States into war, end quote. Widely published in the American press on March 1st, its contents, quote, inflamed American public against Germany, end quote. The direct threat to American territory combined with the ongoing U-boat attacks made Wilson's policy of neutrality untenable. He actually ran in 1916 for his second term on keeping the United States neutral. The path to war then was not paved by a single event, but by a confluence of factors. The powerful undertow of economic interests, the moral outrage sparked by German actions like the Lusitania sinking, and finally the direct threat to national security posed by the Zimmermann's telegram. Wilson's own progressive idealism, which envisioned a moral role for America on the world stage, likely also contributed to his ultimate and grave decision to enter the war. The die was cast. On April 2, 1917, Woodrow Wilson stood before a special session of Congress to ask for a declaration of war, a declaration that would send over 2 million American doughboys, as they were called, into the crucible of the Western Front. He framed America's entry into the Great War not as a quest for power or revenge, but as a crusade for global ideals, maybe even some progressive. Quote, the present German submarine warfare against commerce, he declared, is a warfare against mankind. It is a war against all nations. He emphasized that American ships and lives have been lost, but so too had those of other neutral and friendly nations, stating, quote, there has been no discrimination. The challenge is to all mankind. Wilson was careful to define American motives. Quote, our motive will not be revenge or the victorious assertion of the physical might of the nation, but only the vindication of right, of human right, of which we are only a single champion, end quote. This set the tone of moral righteousness that would characterize much of America's wartime propaganda. He advised Congress to, quote, formally accept the status of belligerent which has thus been thrust upon us, to exert all its power and employ all its resources to bring the government of the German Empire to terms and end the war, end quote. The most enduring phrase from this speech, one that would echo throughout the 20th century, was Wilson's declaration, quote, the world must be made safe for democracy, end quote. He continued, its peace must be planted upon the tested foundation of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make." End quote. He concluded with a somber acknowledgement of the path ahead. Quote, "It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful power into war, but the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, democracy." End quote. To field an army capable of fighting this modern industrialized war, Congress, despite some initial fears of popular resistance, quickly passed the Selective Service Act in May of 1917. This act, requiring men aged 21 to 31 to register for the draft, was, as our textbook notes, quote, "a reasonably equitable and locally administered system," unquote, that avoided the unpopular bonuses and substitutes of the Civil War era. It was a significant assertion of federal power, characteristic of the Progressive era itself, and essential for rapidly building the American Expeditionary Forces, or the AEF. General John J. Pershing was chosen to lead the AEF. He adamantly insisted that American troops fight under U.S. command rather than being integrated piecemeal into British and French units, a decision aimed at boosting American morale, protecting national interests, and ensuring that the U.S. had a distinct role in any future peace negotiations. The journey for the American doughboys was transformative and often terrifying. The average soldier received about 6 months of training in the United States, followed by 2 months in France, and then an introductory month in a relatively quiet sector of the front. They were taught basic drill, how to handle new weapons, and the importance of teamwork, all while building physical fitness. French and British veterans, seasoned by years of brutal trench warfare, provided much of the practical instruction on the realities of this new type of combat. The grimness of this reality is palpable in the writings of soldiers like we heard of earlier, Alan Seeger. Before his death, he described the life of the common soldier. Quote, "His role is simply to dig himself a hole in the ground and to keep hidden in it as tightly as possible. Exposed to all the dangers of war, but with none of the enthusiasm or splendid elan, he is condemned to sit like an animal in its burrow and hear the shells whistle over his head." End quote. This was a far cry from, quote, "the popular notion of the evening campfire, the songs, and good cheer that war brings." Letters from the front paint a vivid picture. PFC James V. Coffin wrote in July 1918 from what he called a badly shot-up town just behind the lines, quote, "While not in the trenches, I had an opportunity to learn how Fritz's shells," Fritz being a short name for Germans, "how the shells sound, especially his high explosives. Everybody in this town must wear his gas mask, our best friend, on the alert position at all times. We even sleep with it on as we had several night alarms." End quote. Another anonymous soldier recounting a harrowing artillery barrage, quote, "For 1 hour and 15 minutes, shells as high as 9 inches fell near and around us, and for that length of time I held the rosary in my hands and said prayers constantly." End quote. While the United States possessed immense industrial potential, its standing army in 1917 was relatively small and unprepared, to say the least, for the scale and the nature of modern European warfare. The AEF's initial reliance on Allied training and, in some cases, Allied equipment underscores this. The rapid mobilization under the Selective Service Act was a testament to the Progressive era's faith in centralized government action to meet a national crisis. America's entry was a bold wager on its capacity to quickly convert its industrial and human resources into a formidable fighting military force. The American soldiers that made it to the Western Front in 1917 were presented with a landscape of unimaginable horror, and it was defined by years of a bloody stalemate. New technologies had transformed warfare into an industrialized process of attrition. Machine guns mowed down attacking infantry, poison gas choked the trenches, tanks lumbered across shell-cratered earth, and airplanes, which were still a novelty, engaged in deadly dogfights and reconnaissance missions. Into this inferno, the American Expeditionary Forces arrived. The AEF saw first significant combat in early 1918, initially providing reinforcements and relieving exhausted Allied units. Their presence, though initially small, had an immediate impact on Allied morale and German calculations. As our textbook notes, quote, the rapid addition of American naval escorts to the British surface fleet and the establishment of a convoy system countered much of the effect of the German submarines, leading to a decline in shipping losses just as American troops began arriving in large numbers. Several key battles highlighted the AEF's growing contribution. At the Second Battle of the Marne in July of 1918, fresh American troops played a crucial role in helping the Allies halt the last major German offensive of the war and launch a counterattack that pushed the enemy back. This battle is widely seen as a significant turning point in the war. September 1918 saw the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, the first major offensive planned and executed primarily by American forces under General Pershing. Over 500,000 U.S. troops participated, and in just 4 days they forced a German withdrawal from a heavily fortified place. This victory, quote, boosted Allied morale and proved that American forces could cooperate and operate effectively on their own, end quote. The largest and most grueling engagement for the AEF was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, launched in late September 19 and lasting until the armistice in November. This massive offensive included over 1 million American soldiers fighting through difficult terrain against determined German resistance. The objective was to break through the German defensive lines and sever their critical supply routes. Casualties were horrific. This campaign remains the largest and deadliest battle in U.S. military history, with over 26,000 American soldiers killed in action and more than 120,000 total casualties. Yet, the offensive succeeded. As our textbook describes, on August 8, 1918, quote, 2 million men of the American Expeditionary Force joined British and French armies in a series of successful counteroffensives that pushed the disintegrating German lines back across France, end quote. German General Erich Ludendorff himself referred to this period as the, quote, Black Day of the German Army, acknowledging that it had exhausted Germany's faltering military effort and made defeat inevitable. The arrival of American forces, millions of fresh troops, backed by America's industrial might, provided the crucial manpower and resources that tipped the balance against the German military, strained by years of war and the constricting Allied blockade. While the U.S. entered the war late, its contributions on the Western Front in 1918 were decisive in hastening the Allied victory and securing President Wilson a powerful voice at the ensuing peace conference. America emerged from the Great War not just as an economic giant, but as a formidable military power on the world stage, a voice they sought to use for peace. While American soldiers fought and died over there, as they would say, the home front underwent its own profound transformation, a massive mobilization of industry, resources, and public opinion, all orchestrated with the progressive era faith in centralized government control and efficiency. Now, the American war effort required an unprecedented mobilization of the national economy not seen before. Drawing on progressive era ideals of efficiency and government intervention, new federal agencies were created to direct resources and production. Though not extensively detailed in your textbook, the War Industries Board, eventually headed by the financier Bernard Baruch, wielded significant power. It could, quote, determine priorities, requisition supplies, conserve resources, commandeer plants, and make purchases for the United States and the Allies. The WIB pressed industries to standardize the production of munitions and other essential goods, often through business-government cooperation that included exemption from antitrust laws. This represented a dramatic expansion of federal economic control, setting precedents for future national crises. Similarly, the Food Administration, under the leadership of Herbert Hoover, aimed to ensure adequate food supplies for American troops and the starving Allied nations. It famously encouraged voluntary conservation campaigns through things like Meatless Mondays, Wheatless Wednesdays, and the Gospel of the Clean Plate, collectively known as Hooverizing. These efforts, reliant on public cooperation in the name of patriotism, fundamentally altered the relationship between the government and the national economy. Mobilizing minds was deemed as crucial as mobilizing materials. President Wilson established the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, headed by the progressive journalist George Creel. The CPI's mission, as described in our textbook, was, quote, to inspire patriotism and generate support for military adventures. Creel and the CPI launched a vast propaganda campaign, utilizing the film industry in Hollywood, which was exploding, and commissioning vibrant posters, publishing pamphlets, and deploying an army of about 75,000 volunteer speakers known as 4-Minute Men. These volunteers delivered short, pro-war speeches at movie theaters and social gatherings across the country. Iconic images like James Montgomery Flagg's Uncle Sam Wants You, you've seen that poster, it became a powerful symbol of this effort. While the CPI succeeded in unifying much of the public behind the war, its methods often, quote, disregarded facts and caused deep anti-German sentiment throughout the country. And it illustrated the ethically fraught nature of wartime propaganda. Financing the war also required a massive public effort. The government launched a series of what would be called Liberty Bonds, employing similar techniques of patriotic appeal and propaganda and social pressure. Posters featuring the Statue of Liberty implored citizens, quote, you, buy a Liberty Bond, lest I perish. Purchasing bonds, which helped to fund the war effort, was framed as a civic duty, and buyers often wore buttons proclaiming their contribution as a badge of honor. These campaigns were remarkably successful, raising an estimated $17 billion for the war effort and, as a byproduct, introducing many middle-class Americans to the concept of investing in securities. The war also significantly transforms social structures. With millions of men joining the military, women stepped into jobs previously inaccessible to them, like working in factories or working on farms or in various service roles. Over 20,000 women served in the U.S. Army Nurse Corps, often near the front lines, while others joined the Navy as yeoman Fs, performing clerical work, driving trucks, even working as mechanics and translators. Lieutenant Van Wert, a Native American woman, volunteered as a nurse in Washington, D.C. during the influenza pandemic, a testament to the diverse contributions of women. These vital wartime contributions provided undeniable momentum for the women's suffrage movement, as we saw in the last episode, that was finally passed in 1920. President Wilson, initially hesitant of their actions, eventually acknowledged that women's participation and sacrifice justified a constitutional change, and it helped to lead to that ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 that granted women the right to vote. Simultaneously, another social structure that was challenged came from what we call the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to northern industrial cities, and this accelerated this migration dramatically. Drawn by the labor shortages created by war production and military enlistment, and seeking to escape the oppressive and violent Jim Crow South, millions of black Southerners left the South, and they reshaped the demographic and the labor landscape of northern urban America. Places like Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia all saw a lot more black people move there. This mass movement, however, also fueled racial tensions that would soon explode in these northern areas. The wartime mobilization, therefore, was a double-edged sword. It showcased the Progressive era's capacity for large-scale centralized organization and fostered a sense of national unity. Yet, this very drive for unity and efficiency led to unprecedented government control over the economy and public discourse, and laid the groundwork for the suppression of civil liberties for those that the War Office deemed disloyal or un-American. The intense patriotic fervor cultivated on the home front had a dark side, a profound intolerance for dissent, and a vicious wave of anti-German sentiment. As our textbook notes, quote, as war passions flared, challenges to the onrushing patriotic sentiment that America was making the world safe for democracy were considered disloyal, end quote. President Wilson himself declared that disloyalty, quote, must be crushed out, and that such individuals had, quote, sacrificed their right to civil liberties, end quote. This atmosphere of fear and suspicion led to widespread persecution of German Americans. German language instruction was banned in schools. German music was removed from concert programs. Books by German authors were burned, and common food items with German names were rebranded. Sauerkraut, for instance, became Liberty cabbage. More alarmingly, German Americans faced public assault, tarring and feathering, and in some cases, lynching, as in the tragic case of Robert Prager in Illinois in 1918. To codify this suppression, Congress passed the Espionage Act in June of 1917 and the Sedition Act in May of 1918. These laws, as described in our textbook, quote, stripped dissenters and protesters of their rights to publicly resist the war. The Sedition Act, which was an amendment to the Espionage Act, was particularly sweeping. It criminalized willfully making false reports to interfere with the military, inciting disloyalty or mutiny, or uttering, printing, or publishing, quote, any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military or naval forces of the United States, or the flag, or the uniform of the Army or Navy, end quote. The Postmaster General was also empowered to block the mailing of materials deemed in violation of this act. The enforcement of these acts was aggressive. Over 2,000 individuals were prosecuted under these acts. Among the most prominent was Eugene V. Debs, the multi-time Socialist Party candidate for president. Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for an anti-war speech delivered in Canton, Ohio, in June 1918. In that speech, he had declared, quote, the working class who make the sacrifices, who shed the blood, have never yet had a voice in declaring war, end quote. Debs was a staunch opponent of what he saw as a capitalist war, and famously stated in another speech, quote, I am opposed to every war but one. I am for that war with heart and soul, and that is the worldwide war of a social revolution, end quote. The Supreme Court upheld these wartime restrictions on free speech and expression. In Schenck versus United States 1919, the court affirmed the conviction of Charles Schenck for distributing leaflets urging resistance to the draft. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., writing for a unanimous court, introduced the, quote, clear and present danger test, arguing that, quote, the question in every case is whether the words used are used in such a circumstance and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the subsistent evils that Congress has a right to prevent. He went on to say that, quote, when a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right, end quote. Other notable prosecutions included anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, socialist editor Victor Berger, and film producer Robert Goldstein, whose movie The Spirit of 76 was seized for its allegedly anti-British and thus anti-Ally sentiment. These acts faced contemporary criticism from pacifists and civil libertarians. Jane Addams, who was a leading progressive reformer and a pacifist, staunchly opposed U.S. entry into the war, believing that international disputes could be resolved nonviolently. Her principled stand led her to being vilified by the press and losing much of her public acclaim from the previous decades. The intellectual Randolph Bourne offered one of the most trenchant critiques of wartime conformity when he famously wrote, quote, "War is the health of the state," end quote. Bourne argued that war was inevitable what leads to the suppression of dissent and the aggrandizement of state power, serving undemocratic ends. In the years following the war, there was a growing recognition of the injustices perpetuated under the Espionage Act and the Sedition Acts. Even some who had served in Wilson's administration acknowledged that, quote, "the general atmosphere of intolerance had led to serious constitutional violations," end quote. Eventually, all those convicted under these acts during World War I were released from prison and granted amnesty. The progressive era's drive for national unity and efficiency in wartime, therefore, came at a significant cost to individual liberties, particularly for those holding dissenting political views or belonging to immigrant groups viewed with suspicion. This period starkly reveals the fragility of free speech in times of national crisis. For African Americans, World War I presented a profound paradox. They were called upon to fight for democracy abroad while being denied the most basic tenets of democracy at home. Yet, as our textbook states, quote, "prevailing racial attitudes among white Americans mandated the assignment of white and black soldiers in different units." The U.S. military was, like much of society, rigidly segregated. The War Department largely, quote, "barred black troops from combat and relegated black soldiers to segregated service units where they worked as general laborers," end quote. They were excluded from the Marines, served only in menial roles within the Navy, and were not permitted in Army aviation units. Even officer training was segregated, with camps like Fort Des Moines in Iowa established for black officer candidates. Despite this pervasive discrimination, many African American leaders, including W.E.B. Du Bois, initially supported the war effort. They saw military service as a path to prove their patriotism and as a demand for full citizenship rights. If you are willing to die for this country, you should be granted the rights within to live in it. The hope was that if black men fought and died alongside white soldiers, white Americans would finally recognize their value and equality. However, the reality for most of the approximately 380,000 African Americans who served was one of continued discrimination. The Army often restricted the privileges of black soldiers, even when they were in Europe, to ensure that their experiences abroad did not lead them to, quote, "question their place in American society" upon their return. Columbus Morris, a black soldier in a labor battalion, later recalled that units were mixed, quote, "you only mingled with your own race." A notable exception was the experience of units like the 369th Infantry Regiment, famously known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Assigned to fight under French command, these black soldiers saw extensive combat and earned a reputation for extraordinary bravery. The French military, which was already accustomed to using colonial troops from Africa and Asia for the French army, often treated black American soldiers with a degree of respect and camaraderie that they had not seen in their times living in the U.S. Robert Sweeney, a black soldier, reflected on his time in France, quote, "that was the only time that I was a full-fledged American citizen because they treated the black soldiers just like they treated the white soldiers. No difference whatsoever." The 369th, quote, "never lost a man through capture, lost a trench or a foot of ground to the enemy," end quote. And the entire regiment, along with 171 individuals, received the French Croix de Guerre for their value, the War Cross. The regimental band, led by James Reese Europe, is also credited with introducing jazz to France. The positive reception by the French was, however, viewed with alarm by white American officials in Europe and back home. The U.S. Army went so far as to issue a directive titled The Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops, which they gave to French military officials, urging them not to, quote, spoil black soldiers by treating them as equals, for fear that they would expect similar treatment upon their return home to the United States. The transformative experience of serving in France, coupled with the continued denial of basic rights at home, fueled a new militancy among returning black veterans. W.E.B. Du Bois captured this spirit in a powerful May 1918 editorial in The Crisis that he titled Returning Soldiers. This is what he wrote, and you can find the longer version in your textbook reader. Quote, "We are returning from war. For the America that represents and gloats in lynching, disenfranchisement, caste, brutality, and devilish insult, for this, in this hateful upturning and mixing of things, we were forced by vindictive fate to fight also. But we return today. We sing, this country is ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. It lynches. It disenfranchises its own. It encourages ignorance. It steals from us. It insults us. This is the country to which we soldiers of democracy return. This is the fatherland for which we fought. But it is our fatherland. It was right for us to fight. The faults of our country are our faults. Under similar conditions, we would fight again. But by the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting." End quote. The war, therefore, acted as a class consciousness awakening for African Americans. The taste of greater equality in France contrasted sharply with the bitter realities of American racism, and this galvanized a generation of Black Americans. This newfound determination to fight for the rights on American soil would soon manifest in the face of brutal post-war violence. The armistice of November 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, ended the fighting in Europe, but for America, it actually ushered in a period of profound domestic turmoil. The peace was anything but peaceful. As the nation grappled with the war's scars, deep-seated racial animosities came to the surface, and a terrifying new global health crisis pushed the country onto the brink. The year 1919 witnessed an unprecedented wave of racial violence across the United States, in a period so bloody it became known as the Red Summer. Our textbook states that this violence originated from the wartime racial tensions brought back home. The Great Migration had brought, as I had mentioned, millions of African Americans from the rural South to northern and Midwestern industrial centers, seeking economic opportunities opened by the war, as well as a chance to escape the violence and humiliation of the Jim Crow South. This demographic shift, coupled with the return of millions of soldiers, both black and white, from the war itself, created a volatile environment. White workers, including returning veterans, often resented black newcomers, seeing them as competition for scarce jobs and housing. Black laborers had also been used as strike breakers, further inflaming the tensions with the white unions. Adding to this volatile mix was the heightened assertiveness of black veterans. Having fought for democracy abroad and having often experienced more equitable treatment of themselves as human beings in France, they were unwillingly to come back home and passively accept the racial subjugation that awaited them back in their home places, including the South. As W.E.B. Du Bois had proclaimed, they were returning fighting. White society, however, largely expected that the return to the pre war racial hierarchy would happen when the war was over. This clash of expectations, fueled by the unresolved legacy of Reconstruction and the quote, persistence of unpunished lynchings, created a tinderbox set for a flame. Lynchings of African Americans had actually increased during the war years, not decreased, rising from 64 in 1918 to 83 in 1919. And it also coupled with a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, revitalized by W.D. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. And there was a surge of membership, something we'll talk about next episode. From April to November 1919, anti-black riots erupted in at least 26 cities across the United States, including Charleston, Omaha, Knoxville, and Washington, D.C., resulting in thousands of injuries, hundreds of deaths, and widespread property destruction. The Chicago race riot from July 27th to August 3rd in 1919 is often considered the most severe of the Red Summer. It was ignited by the drowning of Eugene Williams, a black teenager who had drifted on a raft across an informal segregation line at a Lake Michigan beach. When white beachgoers stoned him and he drowned, and the police refused then to arrest the white man identified by black witnesses as responsible for killing him, outrage and confrontations escalated into a week of widespread mob violence, of murder and arson. The riot left 38 people dead, 23 black and 15 white, as well as 537 injured and around 1,000 black families homeless. Journalist Carl Sandburg, reporting in the Chicago Daily News, identified deep-seated issues of housing shortages, political manipulation, and labor competition as underlying causes. In Washington, D.C., riots broke out on July 19th after rumors spread of an alleged assault on a white woman by a black man. Hundreds of white soldiers and sailors and Marines formed what David Krugler termed, quote, a mob in uniform, attacking African Americans and their neighborhoods indiscriminately. The Washington Post further inflamed the situation with sensationalized reporting. Crucially, black Washingtonians organized and armed themselves for self-defense when official protection failed to materialize. This active black resistance was a defining feature of the Red Summer. Our textbook notes that, quote, recently empowered black Americans actively defended their families and homes from hostile white rioters, often with militant force. This behavior galvanized many black communities, but it also shocked white Americans who alternatively interpreted black resistance as a desire for total revolution or as a new positive step in the path towards black civil rights. James Weldon Johnson, observing the aftermath, he asked this question, quote, can't they understand that the more Negroes they outrage, the more determined the whole race becomes to secure the full rights and privileges of free men? End quote. The Red Summer was a brutal manifestation of America's unfulfilled promise of democracy, a violent reckoning that shattered any illusions that wartime sacrifice alone would dismantle racial injustice. It forever altered American society, leaving deep scars and also stealing the resolve for the long civil rights struggle ahead. As the guns fell silent on the Western Front and racial strife tore through American cities, another, more insidious enemy was taking a devastating toll: the influenza pandemic of 1918. As our textbook grimly notes, quote, during the war, more soldiers died from influenza than combat. This global catastrophe, misnamed the Spanish influenza because Spain was neutral in the war and didn't have a press that was censored, and so it was the first country really to report on it extensively. This influenza strain ultimately claimed an estimated 50 million lives worldwide, with nearly 700,000 of those deaths occurring in the United States. The virus first appeared in the spring of 1918, with an outbreak identified in Haskell County, Kansas, near Camp Funston, one of the nation's largest Army training camps. The crowded conditions of military camps and the constant movement of troops, shuffled between bases, sent home on leave, deployed overseas, created ideal conditions for viruses to spread like wildfire. By September 1918, a mutated, far deadlier second wave of the influenza struck, disproportionately affecting young adults between the ages of 18 and 35. The societal impact was profound. Van Wert, the Native American woman volunteering as a nurse I mentioned earlier, described the grim reality in a letter to a classmate. She recounted working 12-hour shifts, caring for dying soldiers, and witnesses bodies being carried out every 2 or 3 hours. She noted that in D.C., quote, all schools, churches, theaters, and dancing halls were closed on account of this epidemic. Public health measures, then called non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as banning public gathering, closing schools and theaters, and mandating mask wearing, were implemented in many cities, though often with varying degrees of success and a difficult public that would not comply. Philadelphia, for example, notoriously allowed a massive Liberty Loan parade to proceed in late September 1918. Within 72 hours of the parade, every hospital bed in the city was filled with flu patients, and the city suffered one of the highest mortality rates in the nation. In contrast, cities like St. Louis, which implemented measures more quickly and mandated masks more effectively, saw much lower death tolls. Fear and panic became widespread. A Red Cross report from the time described, quote, a fear and panic of the influenza, akin to the terror of the Middle Ages regarding the Black Plague. The renowned physician Victor Vaughan somberly worried, quote, if the epidemic continues its mathematical rate of acceleration, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth within a matter of a few more weeks. Compounding the crisis was the wartime atmosphere. The Wilson administration, concerned about maintaining morale, used the Espionage and Sedition Act to suppress accurate medical reporting on the pandemic's severity, fearing it would undermine the war effort. Newspapers that attempted to sound the alarm were sometimes silenced. The pandemic struck at the height of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, severely compromising the combat capabilities of both American and German armies. Maybe it was the disease that won that. We'll never know. It continued to ravage communities long after the armistice, finally fading in early 1920, but leaving an indelible mark of trauma and loss on a world already reeling from the devastation of war. No cure for influenza then was ever found. The influenza pandemic serves as a terrifying second front, the invisible enemy of war that exposed societal vulnerabilities and compounded the immense suffering of the Great War overall. It should have been a lesson for what happened to us in 2020. World War I was, without question, a watershed moment for the United States. The nation announced and emerged itself on the world stage as a formidable economic power, but now a military power. Its industrial capacity proven, its soldiers having displayed and played a decisive role in the Allied victory. Yet the war's crucible also forged a more complex and contradictory America. The progressive impulse which had driven domestic reform was channeled into an unprecedented mobilization of national resources and public will, but also into the suppression of dissent and the erosion of civil liberties. The lofty ideals of making the world safe for democracy, so eloquently articulated by President Woodrow Wilson, clashed starkly with the persistent realities of racial discrimination at home, a reality that Black soldiers confronted with new resolve and bitterness upon their return. The disillusionment and social upheavals of World War I era set the stage for the cultural dynamism and the conflicts that we're going to see when we study the next time in our next episode on the Roaring Twenties. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Star-Spangled Studies. I'll see y'all in the past.